Buddy Sven Diesel here. We're going to be tying up a predator fiber bait fish. This is pretty much just a bait fish using predator fibers, materials that don't really absorb water, and we're using an Ahrex hook in the vise. This is a saltwater hook, and of course we're going to be using some Semperfli. This is a 6/0 in a wax thread. I think the wax thread grips the materials a little bit better, so we're going to go ahead and start our thread, working it down the shank of the hook. The primary focus of this is just to give something that as we tie in materials throughout the remainder of the fly, that it will provide some sort of gripping to the shank of the hook. That's wax thread really, I think, holds really great to the shank and holding materials in place. And so I'm going to wrap a little bit down the bend and then advance my thread back to the hook point. This particular hook, the SA280, it's a Minno hook, and I really like it. It's a shorter shank than I typically use for some of my bait fish, but I think that it provides the proper placement for where the fish are going to be targeting this and sinking their mouth into to the best of their ability. So the Predator Fibers is made by Semperfli. This is the silver bait fish and white, and it's a non-absorbent material, provides a little bit of profile without adding a ton of bulk. So what we're going to do is, I've already prepped these, but what we'll show you here is I want to take off a chunk that's roughly, when I twist it, the same diameter of wire of the hook. I don't have any other way to measure it other than it's like 42 fibers maybe. I don't know, but you can see it's about the same diameter as the hook, and so different hooks have different diameter, and so that's what I'm using for this. But just a small clump, and if you're off by 10 or 15 fibers, it doesn't matter. But let's go ahead and start our hook. And for the core of this bait fish, I'm going to add a little bit of flash. I've got about 5 strands here. I'm going to fold it in half and then go ahead and tie it in right here at the point. Do 2 wraps in front, and then while holding that at an upward angle, I'll wrap these together on the top of the shank of the hook, just in a tight group, and then I'll advance my thread back to the hook point. And we'll be doing that quite a number of times. And I use my vise here. I want to basically cut it to the end of this Allen screw right here on the vise, but that's about 2 times the length of the shank. And so now that we've got our fibers, I'm going to grab that first little piece of the silver gray. I'll fold it in half, wrap 2 wraps in front, and then I'll loosely go up and over the top of this, working my way backwards, and we'll tie it in right there at the bend, and then I'll do some tighter wraps as I advance back up right there in front of where I previously tied in the silver baitfish predator fiber. And what we're doing is we're creating consistency. If I had a longer hook shank, I'd probably do 4 groups, but for this we're going to be doing 3 groups and then a head. So that will make a little bit more sense here in a minute. But now I'm going to grab the white fiber, same process. This will be tied in a little bit differently. So I tie it in right there even, I advance over it a few wraps, and then I split these down the hook point and then hold them up at a slight angle. And you notice that I'm trying to keep the material as much as I can on top and bottom. And here at the rear, I want to keep it as a nice group so that the tail has a thinner taper to it. As we get up towards the head, I'll kind of splay those a little bit more around the hook shank, but still primarily you want most of the fibers to be on the top and the bottom. I'd say right now we're trying to be 95% to 98% on the top, whereas when we get to the head it's more maybe 80-20. And then for durability purposes, I just put down a little bit of super glue on these finished tied in sections. And so we finished the first section, so I'll advance my thread up roughly another third of this shank, and you can see, you take that little piece and add it, and that's where you want your thread. I'll grab another piece of this silver baitfish color and I'll tie it in on the top, and here we're going to go about 90 to 95% on top. I'll use my thumb here just to, my bobbin's having a little bit of issue here, but you want it primarily, as mentioned, on the top of the hook shank, and then you can kind of get some tighter wraps, but don't wrap back up over that hump. That hump is pushing those fibers up, and so by securing this up against that, it's creating those fibers to go up, but we're also creating a uniform underbody at the same time. So it's kind of cool, a lot of fun. So keep your thread right there at where we just tied in that silver baitfish. We'll do the same thing with the white, and like I said, we're keeping 90 to 95% of these fibers on the top as you get back there towards 3 or 4 wraps, then you splay it around the hook shank, or around the hook point, excuse me, and then we'll come in here with a few tighter wraps, and then that looks pretty good. Most of them are on top. If you were to look from the hook eye down to the hook point, this material will be forming almost an oval, and so that's what we're going for. Taller profile, slender profile, similar to what a fish looks like. So now we'll go right here behind the eye. I'm going to leave about 3 to 4 wraps in front of, between the eye and where I'm at now. And so we're going to do the next section. You can see we got the first third was the tail. The second third is a little bit of the body. And now we're going to tie in the third section of this after we put a little bit of glue down. If you struggle getting fibers trapped on this glue when you're tying in the next section, you can wait for it to dry. I just go for it and hold those materials up at an angle, and that's kind of the trick I use. So same process, nothing new. Tie it in right there. Do 2 wraps in front once you get it placed on the top of the shank, and we're going to have my bobbin get the thread back in here. Never had this many issues. It must not be a good day for tying for me. Anyway, we'll advance back, do 2-3 wraps, and now I'm going to really try to splay these around, getting about 80% on focused on the top. You can see I've got a few fibers there to the side, and that's going to be kind of covering up our thread and also adding a little bit more bulk towards the head, and a little bit wider of a width. And we'll do the same thing on the bottom. I got that 4 to 5 wraps right there between the eye and this material. And then as I advance back, I'll use my thumb to really just kind of splay this, and making sure that we got, we're not going up and over our previously tied section, and getting some nice tight wraps there, and then advance our thread up in front. So there's our 3 main sections that I prepped my material for. You could squeeze 4 in there. I just think that's a little dense and a waste of material. But that's your call. This is a little bit, it's a good size. I love this hook. I mean, that's all I can say. It's got the right length for this, in my opinion, of a shank. It's a heavier gauge wire. But for the last section, the 4th section, what I do is I take these fibers, that same, maybe a little less than what we have been tying, and I fold them in half and cut it. And so basically we're doubling up our material here. So I go a little bit thinner on the clump, so but not significant. Sometimes I forget and grab the same amount, but we'll go ahead and tie that in right here, right at the eye, and we'll do 2-3 wraps in front and kind of leave it, and then I'll grab my white material and we'll do the same thing. So we're going to grab a clump of the same proportion, and we'll basically tie it in and halves it over itself. And I've tied them in where I don't cut them. I just leave that loop, but that makes it a little bit, I wouldn't say more difficult, but I often forget that there's the loop in there when I go to the next step. And so I've gotten in the habit now of always just cutting them in half. It'll make sense here in a minute when we brush it out. So go ahead and tie that in, 2-3 wraps in front of that, and then we're going to do kind of a reverse tie-in. When you're doing like some bigger streamer flies with deer hair and such, we're going to basically form a cone in front of these fibers to push them back, and we're going to use our thread wraps that are going from the hook eye back into this material as what's going to push it down. You don't want to wrap up and over these materials to trap them down, but basically using that pinch wrap, what I'll do is I'll pull all these fibers back, and then I'll sit here and give about 10 to 30 turns depending on how far you want those to fold back. So the more I wrap backwards and build this up, the more of a cone it creates around those fibers. And you kind of want it to just be the beginnings of like a, if you looked at like a drop of water, how the bottom part is kind of curved, forming into that taper as we go to the tail. That's kind of what we're going for. And these materials, when they get wet, they hold their structure because of that waviness and the fact they don't absorb the water. They shed it quickly, and so That looks pretty good to me. And here is why I basically cut those instead of just tying them in with a loop. I just grab like a regular comb, and we'll be basically combing it in half. So I'm going to take all that silver baitfish and separate it onto the top, and we'll take all that white and separate it to the bottom, kind of using our flash here as the divider. And this just makes it a little easier to trim. And remember how we folded on the white on the underside, we folded it to a V, so you got to come on the other side and grab those fibers on the other side, because we weren't grabbing those. And you can see that doesn't really look like a great fly right now. Kind of looks like a mess. Maybe before I got my haircut, this is what I looked like. I don't know. But we're going to use the hook gap here as a reference point. And so with these fibers kind of splayed straight out, I'm going to cut these and trim it so that we're roughly using that hook gap as the measuring tool for how long I want these fibers. And then I'll basically work my way at an angle up towards that flash, and I'll turn it on to the other side. And this time I'll start down here near the rear, because I can see where I want the end to be, and I'll just kind of line up and match to the point that we're going to trim just beyond that hook gap. And when this gets wet, those fibers are going to go back just a little bit more, and we'll shape it a little bit with the resin. But I don't have to worry about fouling or this material coming in as a restriction with the hook gap. And then for the top side, I do it roughly the same length as the bottom. You could go a little heavier, you could go a little less. I would say go heavier and make the underside a little bit more slender, but I do them even personally, and then we just sculpt these. You can spend all the time in the world trimming these, shaping them. Just be careful you can't ever really add length to it. So the more you trim, you can't really go back without tying another fly. So I don't think I've ever really super glued fibers back on. I don't think it's possible, but maybe we could rub some Rogaine on here and it would grow the fibers again, but I highly doubt it. So there we go. We got this roughly trimmed now. If you have some longer scissors, that also helps for shaping these. But we basically wanted a teardrop, and you can see how the material is more dense up here towards the head and then slowly tapers off towards the rear. And that is a pretty decent job for reaching around this hook, around my camera and around a light ring. So that, yeah, I'm pretty happy with the way that looks. I'm just going to inspect to make sure we got all the fibers that are roughly the same length, and we got a really good slender taper there. That looks good. So the next step is we are going to be adding some eyes and making this more lifelike. You can also color these with sharpies, and do them all white or add accent colors. And I think what I want to do is add a little bit of accent colors to this one, but we're going to be using these eyes by Deadmeat Customs. These are a little bit oversized, but I want to make sure that they're seen and that these are angry looking eyes, because this is a mean fly. And how I put these on is I put a big glob of liquid fusion right in the center of where I want to put this eye. This liquid fusion is good stuff. The only con to it is it takes usually overnight to dry, and it dries kind of as a flexible, but I just place the eye right there in the center of the drop, and I'll just push it, oozing all that material out to the sides. But the key is it's pushing it into the core of this fly, so that that liquid fusion now is bonded to those thread wraps that are on the shank of the hook. And that's why I think it's important to use something underneath. I know that these eyes come with an adhesive on the back, but I don't know, early on when tying with eyes I lost too many, and so now I probably go overkill with my making sure they're nice and secure. But this liquid fusion I've had really good luck with. I know there's a lot of materials or products out there you could use. I just have had really good luck with this, and the other advantage is when it gets on your finger, you just rub it off, so it's not like super glue that you have a coating on your fingers for days. And I'll just do this exact same thing to the other side, making sure to put a glob. I might have gone too heavy on the first side, but just make sure you get a little bit that oozes out. Make sure it doesn't ooze into the eye. If you have excess, use your bodkin to kind of get it away from the material or the clump. but we'll go ahead and push those in so it's penetrating the core. And in my opinion, now those two liquid fusions are bonded to each other on each side and kind of just solidified, and going to be make for a real durable fly with these eyes. And it's also giving it a great look, and it gives us the shape of what we want to create here with the head. And here's my second little trick when doing these. Well, let's color this. So I'm just going to color my thread, add a little bit of accent. This is a bluish gray, just a hair, just to add a little bit more kind of barring or speckleness to this. And we'll go ahead and just color that up just a little bit accent and bar the tail. That looks pretty good. And we'll come over here and hit the other side similarly as we did. And if you don't get marker on your fingers when you're tying flies, then you might be doing something wrong, or maybe I am, because I always have glue and marker on my hands. But make sure we cover up that thread. You could also do like a hot head or color it with orange, pink. The options are endless when it comes to coloring and shaping these flies. But we'll go ahead and just make sure our eyes are in the right position. I'm kind of inspecting to see how this head is going to form. And here is my trick so that we don't have to worry about these eyes shifting. You could set it aside and let them dry overnight, but I like to make sure I know where they're going to be. So I'm using a little bit of this flexible Raid Zap resin. I put a drop over the eye, and then I kind of just smooth it around. I'm trying not to brush it into that liquid fusion to mix the materials, but I'm letting it kind of ooze off the sides naturally. And then I'll come over here and I'll put a little bit on the top of the head. I'll do the same thing to the other side, get a nice little drop on there, let it ooze off to the sides, using the brush to push it around the whole eye. And then I'll put resin between the two eyes right there on the head, covering up our thread wraps. And I'll do the same thing under here on the bottom side, putting maybe a generous amount right here, and brush it so that it's bonding eye to eye, and also keeping all those materials in place. And then we will make sure that our eyes are where we want it before I cure this up. And just kind of spend your time, because once you cure it, you can't really go back and uncure it. So I'll inspect it to make sure the eyes are how I like it. I'll kind of curl this back to add a little bit of shape, and there we go. That's a way you can form fibers to the way you want on the head. And some may argue or not like to use a lot of resin on the heads for these and just go with the eyes. That's totally fine too. I haven't had a big difference in hookups, whether I have a resin cone on here or whether I've spent the time and let the eyes dry overnight without using this extra resin. But I do 2 coats just because, like I said, I've had an issue where I had eyes come off. And that sometimes I think eyes make all the difference in the world between something targeting this and something passing on it. And that's just a personal experience. Others could argue differently with me. On that one, there's a huge debate, but I like to use eyes, and I think it helps with the species we'll be targeting with this. And there we go. Make sure you cure it for 10 to 15 seconds. And that is a predator fiber baitfish. These predator fibers don't absorb water, so as soon as you pull this out of the water, when you get to your back cast, it is going to be almost completely dry. And it'll be really fun to cast. You can see it's got a narrow profile, a great taper. So these materials come in a bunch of different colors. Tie some up, fish them. Hope you catch some fish with them.